In the gaslit streets of Victorian Edinburgh, where soot clung to the stones and whispers of invention filled the air, a young woman bent her life to the rhythm of gears and springs. Eleanor Harrow, the city's most gifted horologist, believed the heart of a clock could reveal more truth than any beating pulse. But when she was summoned to restore a grand and peculiar timepiece within the crumbling halls of Dunross House, she discovered that the secrets hidden in its iron bones mirrored those of its master, the reclusive Duke of Dunross. What began as a commission soon became an unraveling, of sorrow, of hope, and of love, each tick and tock carrying her deeper into a story she could never have imagined. Let's jump into the whole story. The fog of an Edinburgh dawn curled like ink around the spires, softening the city's sharpness into a dream. Eleanor Harrow rose before the light had quite broken, her fingers already itching for the brass tools neatly arrayed upon her workbench. She was a creature of habit, of discipline, her mornings stitched by the steady drum of ticking clocks that filled her workshop on Candlemaker Row. Her reputation had spread beyond the closes and wines of the old town. Patrons came with battered pocket watches, parlor clocks, sometimes even carriage mechanisms. She restored each with precision bordering on reverence, yet nothing prepared her for the letter sealed in wax that arrived that morning, its script severe, its crest unmistakable. The Raven of Dunross. The Duke of Dunross was a figure wrapped in smoke and rumor. Some claimed he had gone mad after a tragic loss. Others whispered he had no face left, scarred by fire. He had not been seen in society for more than a decade. That he should call upon a woman, worse still, a tradeswoman, was unheard of. The letter was brief, almost brusque. Miss Harrow, your skills have been recommended. I require immediate attention to a timepiece of great value. You will attend Dunross House by week's end. Discretion is expected. Dunross. Eleanor read it twice, her heart hammering with an uncharacteristic thrill. The commission was audacious. Dunross House stood on the city's edge, overlooking the Firth of Forth, its silhouette like a broken tooth against the horizon. Few entered. Fewer still returned with words to share. Yet something in the letter stirred her, not merely the promise of work, but the mystery that clung to its phrasing. By week's end, she stood before iron gates taller than 3 men, her satchel heavy with tools. The wind off the sea tangled her dark hair, bringing the scent of salt and coal smoke. A single carriage passed her on the lonely road, its wheels crunching frost. Beyond the gates, Dunross House loomed. A fortress of turrets and shadows, its windows shuttered, ivy clawing the stone as though trying to pull it down. She was received by a butler whose silence seemed trained. He led her through halls smelling of wax and damp velvet, past portraits turned to the wall. At last, they entered a chamber vast enough to swallow her workshop whole. At its center stood the clock. Eleanor stopped breathing. It towered nearly to the ceiling, an astronomical clock with dials that mapped not only hours and minutes, but the sweep of planets, the rise and fall of tides. Its face was a gilt sun, fractured with cracks. Its brass hands trembled as if arthritic. Glass domes revealed layers of cogs, some no larger than a coin, others the size of carriage wheels. Dust lay upon it like age upon a face. But it was beautiful. In its stillness, it seemed alive, as though a great heart had only just ceased its beat. "You may begin," said a voice. Eleanor turned. The Duke stood in the shadow of the balcony, half obscured. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered beneath a black coat. His face was indeed marked, though not grotesque, as rumor had claimed. A scar, pale and jagged, traced from temple to jaw. His eyes, gray as winter stone, regarded her with something between caution and curiosity. Eleanor inclined her head, unwilling to betray unease. "It will take time," she said. "Time," he echoed, his mouth twisting in what might have been a smile. "That is what I no longer possess." With that, he withdrew, leaving her alone with the great clock and the silence of Dunross House. Eleanor placed her hand upon the cold brass casing. She felt the faintest vibration, as though deep within its belly, the clock still fought to live. She drew a breath, gathered her tools, and began. The silence of Dunross House pressed upon Eleanor as though the walls themselves were listening. She stood for a long moment before the astronomical clock, her fingers grazing the ornate flourishes carved into its casing. Each pattern was deliberate, spirals resembling seashells, wings half folded, and roses rendered with such precision they seemed ready to unfurl. Whoever had built it had not merely constructed a machine, but crafted a monument. She unlatched her satchel, laying her instruments upon a velvet-draped table. Tweezers, screwdrivers with handles polished smooth, delicate brushes, a loop for magnification. Her world reduced itself to these objects, her breath slowing until it matched the imagined rhythm of gears. Removing the clock's lower panel, she found the interior surprisingly clean, though many of the cogs were misaligned. One gear was engraved with letters so fine she squinted to read them. Memento. Another bore the continuation. Vivere. Remember to live. The words startled her. Clocks did not moralize. They counted. Yet here, a whisper of philosophy lurked among the brass. She brushed away dust, her hand trembling, as though she had stumbled upon a diary rather than a mechanism. From above came the faint tread of footsteps, measured, deliberate. The Duke, she thought, though he did not enter again. His presence was like the tide, unseen, yet felt. By evening, she had charted the outermost layer of the clock, mapping its wounded places. Yet one thing perplexed her. Hidden behind the planetary dial was a compartment sealed with a keyhole so small it seemed meant for a child's toy. No patron had ever mentioned such a feature in a timepiece of this nature. Why conceal a chamber within a clock already so complex? The butler returned at dusk to announce that her chambers had been prepared. She was to remain at Dunross House until her work was complete. Eleanor followed him through halls heavy with history. Tapestries, though faded, hinted at hunts and battles. Staircases spiraled like augurs into darkness. Her room overlooked the sea, the water bruised by twilight. A fire had been lit, though it seemed to fight against the chill seeping through stone walls. On the bedside table, she found a journal, bound in leather, blank, save for a single line penned in a hand unlike her own. Every clock is a confession. Sleep was elusive. The wind battered the windows. The sea groaned against the cliffs. She dreamed of gears turning endlessly, of a heart made not of flesh, but brass, ticking beneath her ribs. When she woke, she found the journal had fallen open to a new page, where fresh words now appeared. Do you hear it too? Her pulse leapt. She had locked the door, bolted it. No one could have entered. And yet the ink glistened, as if freshly laid. At breakfast, the Duke was absent. She dined alone in a cavernous hall, her presence dwarfed by portraits of grim ancestors. The butler offered little conversation, though his eyes lingered upon her with what might have been pity. Back at the clock, Eleanor resolved to confront the mystery directly. With a fine hook, she probed the tiny keyhole. To her astonishment, it yielded not to force, but to touch. As her finger brushed it, the compartment clicked open, Inside lay a locket, its silver tarnished, its hinge stiff. She opened it with care. Within, a miniature portrait revealed a woman with auburn hair and eyes bright as flame. Opposite, a lock of hair had been preserved. A name was engraved so faintly it might have been erased by grief. Catriona. Eleanor's throat tightened. She did not know the story, yet sorrow radiated from the tiny keepsake as surely as dust rose from the floorboards. Why conceal it here, at the heart of the clock? And who had written in the journal that seemed to know her thoughts? The Duke appeared that evening without warning. He lingered at the threshold, the firelight painting his scar in stark relief. "You have opened it," he said softly. Eleanor closed her hand around the locket. She felt suddenly as though she had trespassed. "It was hidden," she replied, her voice steady, though her chest was not. "I thought it part of the mechanism." He stepped forward, the shadows retreating from him. His eyes were unreadable, their grayness neither warm nor cold, but fathomless, like deep water. "Everything here," he said, "is part of the mechanism." And with that, he withdrew, leaving her once more with the great machine that ticked, or perhaps whispered, secrets into her hands. The locket burned against Eleanor's palm long after the Duke's footsteps had faded down the hall. She placed it gently on the velvet cloth beside her tools, its small weight disproportionate to the silence it stirred. Every horologist knew that a mechanism told its maker's truth, ingenuity, flaws, aspirations hidden in metal. Yet never had Eleanor encountered a clock that beat with grief. The portrait inside haunted her. The woman, Catriona, seemed alive even in miniature, her auburn hair painted with such devotion that each brushstroke carried affection. Eleanor closed the locket, but in doing so felt she had shuttered a voice. She longed to ask the Duke who Catriona had been, but his words, "Everything here is part of the mechanism," still echoed. That evening, unable to sleep, Eleanor sat by her chamber's narrow window overlooking the restless sea. The journal lay open on her lap. She had half convinced herself the new line she had read the night before had been an illusion of fatigue. Yet as the fire dwindled, fresh words bled across the page. "The heart you hold is mine. Guard it well." Her breath caught. Ink glistened wetly, though no pen had touched the page. She closed the book with trembling fingers. She was a woman of science, of wheels and springs. She did not believe in phantoms. And yet, something unseen moved here, threading itself into both clockwork and bone. The following days passed in measured labor. Eleanor traced the clock's celestial dials, charted each wheel and lever, sketched diagrams by candlelight. She discovered oddities at every layer, a cog shaped like a tear, a pendulum counterweight inscribed with a date, March 17, 1851. When she asked the butler about that year, his mouth tightened as though stitched shut. More curious still were the sounds. At night, when the corridors were hushed and only the sea muttered, she heard faint ticking from the workshop, though the clock was not yet restored. Sometimes it grew louder, a heartbeat echoing through stone. Other times it slowed, as though sighing. Eleanor was not easily unsettled. Precision was her anchor. And so she recorded each anomaly in the journal, though she dared not reread the otherworldly entries it seemed to inscribe of its own accord. One afternoon, as pale sun fell through the high windows, the Duke entered. He stood closer this time, enough for her to note how his scar softened near his temple, how one eye was slightly darker than the other. His hands, clasped behind his back, were strong, but bore faint burns, as though he had once held fire itself. "You have made progress," he said. "I have uncovered its layers," Eleanor replied, reluctant to betray how deeply the clock had unsettled her. "But some elements seem less like function and more like memory." He regarded her with a shadow of a smile. "And is memory not a function, Miss Harrow? Without it, what would any of us be?" She dared to meet his gaze. "And Catriona? Was she your memory?" For the first time, his composure cracked. His shoulders stiffened, his eyes flickered with something sharp, then weary. "You presume much," he said quietly, yet his voice lacked anger. "Catriona was my wife. She is no longer." The words hung like frost. Eleanor lowered her eyes, the weight of the locket pressing on her heart, though it lay still on the workbench. "I did not mean to wound," she murmured. "You did not," he said, though his voice was raw. "The wound was dealt long ago." He turned, preparing to leave, but paused at the threshold. "There is more to that clock than you yet know. Finish your work, Miss Harrow. You will find answers where you least expect them." That night, Eleanor lit no candle, wishing for darkness to protect her from the weight of the house. Yet again she dreamed. In her sleep, she stood within the clock itself, gears towering like cathedral spires, their teeth glinting. At the center, a pendulum swung, not brass, but a great silver heart, ticking with mournful rhythm. Each beat released a whisper, Catriona's name, over and over, until Eleanor woke with the taste of salt tears on her lips. The journal lay open on her bedside table, though she had closed it firmly before bed. Across the page, a single phrase stretched, written in hurried, anguished strokes. "Help me keep her alive." Eleanor pressed her hands to her mouth, staring until the ink blurred. Was it the Duke? Was it the house itself? Or was it her own mind, unraveling beneath the weight of secrecy? Whatever the truth, she knew one thing. She could no longer treat the astronomical clock as a commission alone. It was not just a machine. It was a heart, his heart, and in some inexplicable way, it had begun to beat with hers. The days at Dunross House unfolded like a series of veils, each one lifted to reveal another layer of mystery. Eleanor worked at the astronomical clock from morning until dusk, her hands deftly coaxing life back into its weary bones. Yet every time she brushed away grime or realigned a gear, she felt less like an artisan and more like a trespasser in someone's soul. The Duke seldom appeared, yet his presence threaded through the house as surely as the sea winds threaded the cliffs. She glimpsed him in passing, pacing the library at dawn, standing motionless in the garden long after frost had claimed the roses, or once, in the chapel, his hand resting upon a pew as if weighed by invisible stone. He moved with a dignity that veiled fragility, like a soldier refusing to limp despite his wound. One storm-bound evening, when rain rattled the windows like impatient fingers, he entered the workshop unannounced. Eleanor, bent over the open casing of the planetary dial, started at the sound of his boots on stone. He did not speak at first. Instead, he watched her work, the fire casting uneven light across his scar, softening it into something almost noble. "You have given her breath again," he said at last, his voice low, reverent. Eleanor looked up. The clock's tied dial had begun to move, a slow sweep of blue enamel waves marking lunar pull. "Not yet," she replied, "but she stirs." "She," he echoed, as though testing the word. "You see it too." Their eyes met, and for a suspended instant, the storm outside seemed to still. Eleanor's throat tightened, for in his gaze she saw not only sorrow, but longing, a yearning that had no name. The Duke drew nearer. His gloved hand brushed the casing of the clock, fingers lingering upon the place where Eleanor had discovered the hidden locket. "Catriona," he said, the syllables breaking. "She died 12 years ago this month, a fever that burned through her like fire. I tried, God knows I tried, to save her. I even—" He stopped, the words faltering. His eyes flicked toward the clock. Eleanor felt the weight of silence grow thick between them. "This clock," she whispered. "You built it for her?" He nodded. "I commissioned its maker, a genius, though half mad. I told him I wanted time itself to honor her, that each star, each tide, each hour should bow to her name. But he gave me more than I asked. He gave me a prison." Eleanor frowned. "A prison?" His voice dropped. He wove memory into mechanism. Every wheel recalls her. Every dial beats with the hour of her death. When the clock stands silent, I am almost free. But when it stirs— He closed his eyes briefly, as though against pain. "She is here, and gone. At once." The fire cracked, throwing sparks. Eleanor's heart twisted. She understood the cruelty of a machine that refused to let grief settle into silence, keeping it forever raw. "But you asked me to mend it," she said softly. "I did," he replied, his eyes opening again, steel gray and unyielding. "Because I cannot destroy it. And perhaps I do not wish to." He turned away then, shoulders rigid, as though ashamed of the confession he had allowed. "You must think me weak," he murmured. Eleanor rose from her stool, the words spilling from her before caution could catch them. "No, I think you human." The Duke stilled. For a long moment he said nothing, only breathing in the storm-scented air. Then, with a nod that seemed both acknowledgement and dismissal, he left the chamber. That night, Eleanor could not bring herself to touch the journal. Instead, she sat at her workbench long past midnight, tracing diagrams of the clock's inner constellations. Yet the Duke's words circled her mind, as relentless as the tide. She thought of the locket, of the inscription, "Memento vivere," remember to live. What cruel irony, she mused, that a mechanism built to enshrine love had become a tomb that refused to close. As the fire dwindled, she heard it again, the ticking. Not from the clock, but from within her own breast, as though her heart had begun to echo its rhythm. She pressed her palm against her ribs, startled by the steadiness of the beat. It was not grief she felt, but connection. A tether pulling her inexorably toward the Duke, toward his sorrow, toward the haunted heart of Dunross House. The storm broke by dawn, leaving the city washed clean beneath a pale sun. Yet within Dunross House, the air remained heavy. Eleanor descended to the great hall, intending to request more oil for her lamps, but paused at the threshold. The Duke stood before a portrait shrouded in cloth. His hand hovered near it, hesitant before he let it fall. His shoulders bowed, and for the first time, Eleanor saw him not as a duke or a master of a crumbling estate, but as a man undone. She withdrew silently, giving him the privacy grief demanded. Yet in that moment, she made a decision she could neither name nor resist. She would not only restore the clock, she would free him from its chains, even if it meant risking her own heart in the process. The morning after the storm, Dunross House seemed quieter, though not with peace. It was the kind of silence that pressed upon the ear, as if waiting for something to break it. Eleanor returned to the astronomical clock with her satchel of tools, her resolve firm. The Duke's confession weighed heavily in her thoughts. a prison, he had called it. Yet when she laid her hands upon the brass casing, she could not help but feel the clock thrum faintly under her touch, as though some fragment of Catriina's spirit lingered within the mechanism. She disassembled the planetary dial with painstaking care. Beneath it, she discovered a series of nested wheels, engraved with delicate constellations. Each star bore a mark, tiny, almost imperceptible, etched in a script she did not recognize. When she leaned closer, she realized the marks formed words, not in English, but in Latin. Vita brevis. Life is short. Amor aeternus. Love is eternal. Her hand trembled. These were not simple embellishments. They were invocations, stitched into the very marrow of the machine. As she traced the letters, a faint sound filled the chamber. At first, she thought it was the rustling of the sea wind through the shutters. But no, the sound grew clearer, sharper. It was a whisper. She froze. The words were indistinct, hushed, as though several voices spoke at once from the cogs themselves. She leaned nearer, the loop still perched over her eye. Catriona. Her breath hitched. She jerked back, tools clattering against the table. The whisper ceased at once, leaving only the crackle of the fire and her racing heart. For a long moment she sat motionless, forcing her breath steady. She was not a fanciful woman. She did not believe in haunting. And yet, the journal. She had sworn not to open it, but her hand reached for it nonetheless. She flipped to the last page she had written in, where her own neat script described the planetary dial. Below it, in a darker hand, words had appeared overnight. You hear us now. Do not be afraid. Eleanor closed the book with a snap, her pulse galloping. If the Duke knew. But no, he must never see these pages. This was her burden alone. That evening, over a sparse supper in the cavernous dining hall, the Duke studied her. The candlelight cast shifting shadows across his face, deepening the scar that cut from temple to jaw. You are pale, Miss Harrow, he observed. Only weary, she lied, setting down her spoon. Perhaps, he murmured, or perhaps my house weighs upon you. Their eyes met across the long oak table. For an instant, she thought he might press further, but he merely inclined his head, retreating once again behind his fortress of restraint. Eleanor's spoon lay untouched. She thought of the whisper that had breathed Catriina's name, of the plea inked in the journal, help me keep her alive. That night, she worked late by lamplight, determined to test the clock rather than fear it. She reassembled part of the dial, aligning the gear teeth precisely. Slowly, tentatively, she wound the mainspring. The clock shuddered. The planetary dial rotated, stars glinting faintly as enamel caught the light. The tide wheels shifted, marking the moon's pull. A sound filled the chamber, not merely ticking, but layered, as though beneath the beat of seconds another rhythm pulsed. A voice, soft, unmistakable, rose with the mechanism. Alexander. Eleanor staggered back, her blood freezing. The name lingered like perfume in the air, tender and sorrowful. Alexander. The Duke's name. The clock continued to turn, whispering in tones just shy of words. Eleanor pressed her hands over her ears, but the sound seemed to bypass flesh and bone, sinking directly into her chest. When she tore her hand from the winding key, the mechanism slowed, faltered, and fell silent. The chamber was once more still, but the impression of the voice clung like smoke. Eleanor's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her loop. The Duke found her there hours later, slumped at her workbench, her tools scattered. She roused when she sensed his presence, blinking into the firelight. "You push yourself too hard," he said quietly. She straightened, her voice hoarse. "Do you ever hear it?" He paused. His gaze slid to the clock, then back to her. "I hear her," he admitted, his voice raw. "Always. That is my curse." Eleanor's breath trembled, but she did not speak. She feared if she confessed the truth, that the clock whispered not only to him, but to her. It would tether her to his sorrow forever. Yet in her silence, she understood something with startling clarity. Dunross House was not merely a mausoleum of grief. It was a crucible, and she had stepped into its fire. The next morning dawned thin and gray, the kind of Edinburgh light that seemed to erase color from stone and skin alike. Eleanor dressed with trembling hands, her mind still ringing with the voice that had emerged from the clock. She told herself it was fatigue, imagination conjured from the Duke's confession. Yet beneath reason, something deeper stirred. Awe, laced with fear. When she returned to the workshop, the astronomical clock loomed in silence, its brass face glinting dully. She set her satchel on the table and forced herself to breathe evenly. She was a horologist, not a mystic. Metal did not speak. Gears did not grieve. And yet she had heard it, clear as any human voice. She opened her notebook, determined to impose order. On one page she listed every anomaly she had found. Engraved Latin, hidden locket, compartmentalized gears. On another, she began to sketch the arrangement of the planetary wheels. As her pencil traced arcs, she noticed something odd. The inscriptions formed not random placement, but a pattern. Each phrase was positioned to align with a particular constellation. Vita Brevis, nestled beneath Aquarius. Amor Eternus traced across Virgo. As she connected them with her pencil, a shape emerged. Not a chart of stars, but a series of interlocking circles, like petals of a flower. The design was too deliberate to be coincidence. She turned the page, calculating ratios, angles, distances. The pattern resembled not only a flower, but something more precise, a code. By evening, she had mapped half the inscriptions, her hands smudged with graphite. The more she uncovered, the more certain she became. The astronomical clock was not merely memorial, nor even ornament. It was an instruction. That night, the journal once again betrayed her resolve. She had locked it in a drawer, yet when she returned from supper, it lay open upon her desk, its pages whispering in the lamplight. Fresh words sprawled across the paper. Follow the circles. They will show you the heart. Eleanor pressed her palm against the page, half in fury, half in plea. "What are you?" she whispered. No ink appeared in answer. Only silence, thick and watchful. The Duke summoned her to the library the next day. She found him seated at a massive desk littered with correspondence, though his hands were still, his gaze fixed upon the fire. Books towered around him, spines worn from long solitude. "You have remained longer than I expected," he said without looking at her. "The clock demands it," Eleanor replied carefully. "And you obey its demand." His eyes lifted to hers, pale gray and piercing. "Tell me, Miss Harrow, have you begun to hear what I hear?" Eleanor's breath caught. She hesitated too long, and in her silence he seemed to find his answer. He gave a grim, almost tender smile. "Do not fear it," he said. "The first time is always the most shattering. After that, it becomes unbearable in other ways." Her chest tightened. "And yet, you will not let me stop." "Would you stop?" he countered softly. "If you knew that in these walls, in this mechanism, a voice long gone still lingered, would you silence it forever?" She had no reply. The locket weighed like a stone in her satchel. The Duke rose, pacing to the shelves. His hand hovered over spines, then withdrew. I was a fool to commission it, to cage her in brass and gear, but I am more a coward, for I cannot destroy it. So I turn to you, Miss Harrow. Perhaps you will see what I cannot. His words struck her not as command, but plea. Eleanor returned to the clock with renewed determination. She followed the pattern of inscriptions deeper, layer by layer, until she reached a section of the mechanism she had not yet dared dismantle, the core beneath the tide dial. Here, the gears were different, finer, more delicate, interlocking in triple sets. Each tooth was etched with markings too small to read by eye alone. She adjusted her loop, holding the lamplight steady. The teeth formed letters. Not Latin this time, but English. Words stretched across the circle, visible only when the gear turned in motion. Slowly, she wound the spring and watched as the hidden message revealed itself one letter at a time. When time stops, the heart remembers. Eleanor's breath caught. She felt the words settle into her like truth. This was no ordinary horology. The maker had buried poetry in the steel, a riddle within a riddle. The whisper rose again, faint but insistent. She pressed her ear closer, though dread crawled along her spine. Find me. The voice, female, sorrowful, brushed against her mind like a hand through mist. Eleanor staggered back, her shoulder colliding with the workbench. Tools spilled across the stone floor. She stood trembling, staring at the clock. The mechanism ticked faintly, innocent in appearance, as though it had not just spoken. Yet the words lingered in her chest, searing into resolve. If there was a heart buried within the machine, she would find it. For the Duke, for herself, for the woman whose voice would not fade. The phrase lingered in Eleanor's thoughts long after she left the workshop. When time stops, the heart remembers. She repeated it to herself as she walked the drafty halls of Dunross House, her footsteps echoing against stone. It was both a riddle and a promise, and though she did not yet understand it, she felt it tugging at her like a compass towards some unseen point. She could not sleep. At midnight, she returned to the chamber where the astronomical clock loomed, its dials dim in the lamplight. The silence there felt charged, as if the very air waited for her to move. She circled the machine, running her hands along its casing, searching for seams, for hidden catches. At the base, beneath the planetary dial, her fingers brushed against a small indentation she had overlooked before. A keyhole, nearly invisible, disguised among engravings of roses. She bent close. It was unlike the others, smaller still, finer than any standard key might fit. She fetched the locket from her satchel. The clasp's narrow hinge gleamed faintly. Heart pounding, she tried it against the opening. It slid perfectly into place. With a soft click, the panel sprang open. Inside lay a narrow chamber, lined with velvet, long faded to gray. And within, a key. It was unlike any Eleanor had seen. Delicate, its bow fashioned in the shape of a heart, its shaft etched with concentric circles. She held it reverently, knowing instinctively this was no mere tool, but the clock's soul made tangible. The moment her fingers closed around it, the whisper came again, clear as if spoken beside her ear. "Do not let me fade." She gasped, nearly dropping the key. The chamber around her seemed to tighten, shadows pressing close. She turned, half expecting the Duke to stand in the doorway, but she was alone. The next morning, she sought him out, finding him in the winter garden, where skeletal vines clung to trellises and frost laced the ground. He stood bareheaded in the cold, his gaze lost in distance. "I found a key," she said without preamble, the words spilling in breathless urgency. His eyes snapped to hers, sharp as a hawk's. "A key?" "In the base of the clock, hidden. It was meant to be found." She hesitated, then added, "With it, I think I can reach the mechanism's true heart." The Duke's jaw tightened, as though she had named something forbidden. He turned from her, staring toward the horizon where the Firth of Forth shone pale. "You must leave it," he said at last, his voice hard. "Do your work. Restore what is broken, but do not go further." "Why?" Eleanor pressed. "What are you afraid of?" He turned then, and the pain in his eyes struck her like a blow. "That it will give me back what I cannot bear to lose again." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind tugged at her hair, the frost crunched beneath their boots. She longed to reach for him, to say the words he could not, but something in his stance forbade it. She bowed her head. "As you wish, Your Grace." Yet even as she said it, she knew she could not obey. That night, she returned to the clock, the heart-shaped key clutched tight. She waited until the house was silent, then knelt before the hidden chamber. Her hands trembled as she slid the key into the slot at the mechanism's core. The gears stirred at once. The astronomical dial spun slowly, stars chasing planets, tides rising and falling in miniature. But deeper still, she heard it. The pulse. Not mere ticking, but a rhythmic thrum, slow and deliberate, like the beating of a heart. The voice rose with it, no longer faint, but clear, resonant, filling the chamber. "Alexander!" Eleanor's throat constricted. She staggered back, but the clock's presence pressed forward, a tide impossible to resist. The voice shifted, softer now, almost tender. "Remember." And then the dials slowed. The gears faltered, and the great clock fell into silence once more. Eleanor pressed her back to the cold wall, chest heaving. The key lay heavy in her palm. She understood now. This was no mere timepiece. It was a vault, a vessel, perhaps even a soul preserved. She could not, would not, abandon it. But how could she tell the Duke that the voice of his dead wife still lingered, waiting to be released? The heart-shaped key remained in Eleanor's pocket the next day, warm against her palm as though it pulsed with its own life. She could not bring herself to part with it, nor to confess to the Duke what she had unlocked. The voice, Katrina's voice, still reverberated in her chest. "Alexander, remember." She returned to her work as though nothing had changed, polishing the enamel face of the planetary dial, aligning the tiny gears that tracked the phases of the moon. But every motion carried weight now, for she knew the mechanism was more than brass and balance. It was memory embodied, grief made mechanical. By mid-afternoon, the Duke entered, silent as shadow. Eleanor sensed him before she saw him, his presence tightening the air. She straightened, her hands falling still upon the workbench. "You have advanced further than I expected," he said, his gaze sweeping the clock. "I have done what I can," she replied carefully. He stepped closer, his scar catching the light, his eyes unreadable. "And yet you are keeping something from me." Eleanor stiffened. "I do not understand." "You do," he said, not unkindly. "Your eyes betray you. I know that look. It is the same one I wear when I cannot speak her name." Her breath faltered. She looked down at her hands, still smudged with oil, and felt suddenly like a child before a tutor, caught in some forbidden act. The Duke exhaled, a sound between weariness and surrender. Miss Harrow, I cannot bear shadows any longer. If the clock has yielded something to you, tell me. Her fingers closed around the key in her pocket. She drew it out slowly, holding it between them. The firelight glinted upon its heart-shaped bow. I found this, she whispered, hidden at the base. When I turned it, the clock spoke. The Duke recoiled as if struck. His face blanched, and for a long, taut moment he could not find his voice. At last he whispered, You heard her. Eleanor nodded, the weight of confession settling between them. His hands trembled as he reached for the key, but did not take it. His eyes burned with something fierce, something raw. What did she say? Eleanor's throat tightened. To speak it felt like trespass, yet she could not lie. She called your name, and then she said, Remember. The Duke's composure shattered. He staggered back, pressing a hand to his brow, his shoulders bowing beneath invisible weight. A sound tore from him, half sob, half laugh, wild and desperate. After all these years, he murmured, Still she haunts me. Still she binds me. Eleanor stepped toward him, compelled though afraid. Perhaps it is not haunting, she said softly. Perhaps it is. Love that endures. His eyes lifted to hers then, storm bright. Love that endures is a blessing only if one may return it. But when it clings to an empty grave, it is torment. Silence pressed between them, heavy with truths neither could unmake. Eleanor longed to reach for him, to lay a hand upon his arm, but something restrained her. A respect for his grief, or perhaps fear of her own. The Duke turned sharply away, his coat swirling. Leave me, he said, voice hoarse. I beg you. She obeyed, retreating through the door with the key still clutched in her hand. That night, Eleanor walked the echoing halls of Dunross House, restless as the sea outside. She paused before a tall mirror, gazing at her own reflection. A woman smudged with oil and ash, her hair escaping its pins, her eyes too bright with secrets. She had come here to mend brass, yet found herself mending a man, or perhaps breaking him further. In her chamber, the journal awaited. Its pages once more bore fresh ink. The heart cannot heal if it is never opened. Eleanor closed her eyes, tears pricking unbidden. She did not know if the words were Katrina's, or some phantom, or the echo of her own conscience. But she knew they were true. The next day, Eleanor found the Duke in the chapel. He sat alone in the pews, his hands clasped, his head bowed. Light filtered through stained glass, scattering fragments of crimson and gold across the scar that marked his face. He looked less like a lord than a penitent. She stepped quietly inside. He did not lift his head, but his voice carried through the still air. I used to pray that she might be returned to me. Then I prayed that I might forget her. Now, I pray for nothing at all. Eleanor's hand tightened on the pew before her. Perhaps the clock is not her prison, but her gift. A way of reminding you that love is not erased by death. At this, he lifted his gaze to hers, his eyes brimming with anguish and something else, something fragile, yearning. And if I cannot bear the gift? He asked. Eleanor's voice was steady, though her heart raced. Then let me bear it with you. For a long time he only stared at her, as though her words were more unbelievable than any whispering mechanism. Then, slowly, he bowed his head. The storm had gathered by evening, winds shrieking across the Firth of Forth and rattling the shutters of Dunross House. Eleanor lit every lamp in the workshop, the glow trembling across the astronomical clock's enamel face. Tonight, she resolved, the truth would not remain locked. The Duke entered without a word. He had discarded his cravat, his coat damp with rain, his hair unbound from its usual severe order. He looked younger like this, and more broken. His eyes met hers, dark with fear and expectation. "You mean to turn the key again?" he said. It was not a question. Eleanor held the heart-shaped key in her palm. Yes. For a long moment he stood motionless, the storm howling around them. Then, with a voice low and ragged, he said, "Do it." She knelt before the clock's hidden chamber, the Duke at her side. Her hands shook as she slid the key into the narrow slot, its edges meeting the teeth of the lock with a metallic sigh. With a breath she did not know she held, she turned it. The gears leapt to life. The planetary dial spun, stars whirling across their enamel heavens. The phases of the moon chased themselves around the circumference. And then came the sound, no mere ticking now, but the unmistakable rhythm of a human heart. The chamber filled with light. Not bright, but soft, a shimmer as if moonlight had taken form. And through it came the voice. "Alexander." The Duke flinched, his hand gripping the bench until his knuckles blanched. Tears streaked his scarred cheek, unheeded. "Alexander," the voice said again, tender, filled with music. "If you are listening, then the clock has not failed. You will not forget me. You will not lose what was ours." Eleanor's breath caught. It was not a ghost, not truly. This was a message, a recording in clockwork, preserved through genius and devotion. Yet it felt alive, achingly so. The Duke fell to his knees, his face lifted to the shimmering dials. "Catriona," he whispered, his voice breaking. The voice continued, as though answering him. "I know the risk I take. To bind my voice to these gears is to tether you to memory, when perhaps you should be free. But love does not reason. Love does not release. If you must hate me for this, hate me. But know that I loved you beyond all measure, beyond time itself." The gears slowed. The dials faltered. The shimmer faded. The clock stilled, and silence reclaimed the room. The Duke bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. Eleanor laid a hand upon his arm, gentle as falling ash. He did not draw away. "She gave you this," Eleanor whispered, "not to imprison you, but to remind you, to give you permission to grieve and to live." He lifted his face, ravaged by tears. "And what am I to do with such a gift? Keep listening until the pain consumes me." "No," she said softly. "You are to carry it forward. She loved you past her own life, Alexander. That is not a chain. It is a light." His eyes met hers then, and for the first time they held not only sorrow, but a spark, small, fragile, but undeniable. For days afterward, the Duke was changed, not lighter nor healed, but unburdened in some deep place. He walked the halls of Dunross House with a slower step, pausing before portraits he had long ignored. He spoke to his servants with more gentleness, as if remembering they too bore lives beyond his grief. And with Eleanor, he allowed silence to become ease. They worked side by side at the great clock, polishing, balancing, adjusting, until its face gleamed with renewed brilliance. She taught him the language of gears, and he listened as a student, not a master. One evening, as they stood before the restored mechanism, he said quietly, "I used to think time was my enemy, that every hour pulled her further from me. But perhaps time is what carries her voice to me still." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart stirring with something both tender and dangerous. "Time is not cruel, Alexander. Only how we meet it can be. The storm had passed. A hush settled over Edinburgh, the city cloaked in a fragile peace. Within Dunross House, the clock stood whole again, its dials tracking the heavens, its heart beating in quiet rhythm. Yet Eleanor knew their story was not finished. Restoring the clock had mended brass and balance, yes, but it had also awakened a bond between her and the Duke, one as intricate and perilous as any mechanism. And bonds, once formed, could not be ignored. Spring came shyly to Edinburgh, as though reluctant to disturb the city's soot-darkened stones. Snowdrops pushed through thawing soil, and pale sun found its way through the narrow winds. At Dunross House, where winter had seemed eternal, the air softened too. Eleanor lingered in the great chamber one morning, polishing the last of the clock's brass casings. The machine now gleamed as it must once have, a monument of brilliance and devotion. Every dial spun in perfect alignment, every pendulum swung true. And yet, as she tightened the final screw, she felt a pang of sorrow, for her work here was ending. The Duke entered quietly, though she sensed him at once. He no longer seemed a figure carved from shadow. The scar upon his face remained, but his eyes had changed. Grief still dwelled there, but no longer as a tyrant. "But you have given me back more than a clock," he said. His voice was steady, yet thick with meaning. "I owe you a debt I can never repay." Eleanor set aside her tools, wiping oil from her hands. "There is no debt, Your Grace. It was her gift, not mine. I only turned the key." He stepped nearer, and his gaze softened. "You speak as though you are apart from it. But without you, I would never have faced what lay within. Without you, I might still be hiding in silence." Her heart thudded painfully. She lowered her eyes, uncertain of what she dared to hope. That evening, he invited her to walk with him through the gardens. The air smelled of damp earth and blooming crocus, the sky awash with apricot light. They paused before the ruined fountain at the center, its basin cracked, ivy curling through the stone. "This house is filled with ghosts," the Duke murmured. "I thought to shut them away, to bar every door against memory. But now I see. It is not memory that destroys. It is refusing to live alongside it." Eleanor looked at him, the fading sun gilding his features, and saw not only the broken man he had been, but the man he could become. "What will you do?" she asked softly. He turned to her fully then, his expression unguarded. "Live if I can, and if you would permit me, live not alone." Her breath caught. The words hung between them, like the pause of a pendulum before its next swing. She had not dared to imagine he might speak them, yet here they were, fragile and immense. "I came here to mend a clock," she whispered, "and somehow found myself mending a heart." His hand lifted, hesitant, then rested against hers. "No, Eleanor, you gave mine a new one." The days that followed were filled with quiet joy, tentative as dawn. Eleanor remained at Dunross House, not as a hired craftswoman, but as something more, an equal in both intellect and affection. Together they studied the clock, marveling at its genius. Together they walked Edinburgh's streets, unnoticed in the bustle, two souls rediscovering the world. Yet they never forgot Katrina. Often, they would sit before the clock as its heart ticked steadily, and the Duke would speak her name without fear. Eleanor did not flinch from it. She knew love was not diminished by sharing, it was enlarged. And when, months later, he asked her to remain with him always, he did not speak of replacing the past. He spoke of continuing it. "Time," he said, pressing the heart-shaped key into her palm, has carried me through grief and into you. Will you walk with me into whatever hours are left? Eleanor closed her fingers over the key. Yes. The clock chimed then, as though answering, its voice rich and resonant. The heavens spun, the pendulum swayed, and beneath it all beat the steady, unwavering rhythm of a heart that would not be stilled. Thus ended the story of the horologist and the Duke, of a clock that held memory and a love that learned to move forward. In the turning of gears and the silence of pauses, they discovered that time was not only loss, but possibility. And so, dear listener, may you carry this tale with you, that even when time seems cruel, it also offers renewal. Let us remember that every clock, every heart, beats not only for what has passed, but for what is yet to come.